Welcome back to Turpentine VC, the podcast where we discuss the art and science of building successful venture firms, VC to VC. This week, we're airing something a bit different in light of a significant $2 billion valuation announcement from Mercor, backed by Felices, GC, and Benchmark. 6 months ago, Turpentine's show 1 to 100 host Usman Hanif interviewed Brendan Foody, Mercor's CEO. At that point, the company had grown from zero to mid-seven-figure revenue in just 1 year. This interview is a glimpse into the foundations on which the company is scaling and the massive market opportunity Mercor is going after. Please enjoy and check out 1 to 100, which also features similar interviews with the CEOs of Braintrust, Foundry, Clay, and Modal.
Brendan, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you so much for having me, Usman. I'm excited about the conversation and have listened to a few of your episodes, so thrilled to have a conversation.
Awesome. Well, for starters, you guys have gone from zero to mid-seven figures in revenue in a year. Clearly, you have something that people want. For listeners who may be unfamiliar with what that is, I'd love for you to explain what is it that you guys have built that people are dying for.
Yeah, so a basic way of thinking about the business is that there's this huge industry around staffing where people will manually review resumes, manually conduct interviews, and manually match people with jobs. And Mercor builds and trains models that automate all of those processes. Reviewing resumes, just like how humans can go about doing that, joining a Zoom room and conducting an interview that's far more in-depth than a human is even able to do. And our most important technology is in facilitating the matching process, where we train very large models that understand all of the characteristics that predict why someone is likely to do well at a given job or task. And an interesting application of this technology is that many of our clients are hiring high volumes of expert contractors to build out human data teams, leveraging all of this infrastructure to better find the best experts in the world.
I see. And so concretely, if someone was to log on to Mercor's website, what does the experience look like from the candidate's perspective and then from the perspective of the employers?
Yeah, so they can go on to work.mercor.com as a candidate where they upload their resume. They'll join an interview where they can talk to an AI that will ask them questions about their projects, about the nuances of their work experience. They'll get feedback on those and then get potentially matched with a job. On the client side, they can go to team.mercor.com and they can query for any role that they want to hire for, where we have an AI-powered search and evaluation system that will recommend the candidates that have applied to our talent pool and are the best fit. So we have over 300,000 candidates that have gone through that process on the applicant side and can surface all of the best profiles for employers and companies that are looking to hire.
Awesome. And so what do you think it is about your guys' experience that makes it 10x better than, say, other competition or what companies are used to doing in the status quo? Is it speed, quality, user experience? You guys have a good amount of traction and some large companies using you. Why are they picking you?
Yeah, so the dimensions that customers tend to care about the most are speed, quality of the candidate that you're surfacing, and then also the price. And all of these dimensions are usually constrained by manual processes. When you're hiring a software engineer remotely, you might need to conduct, a dozen interviews to find a candidate that's good. And even then, it might have not been a good pool to start with. And the candidate might not have been exactly what you were looking for. But when all of a sudden you're able to leverage technology to assess and interview hundreds of thousands of people at the cost of software, you're able to find candidates that are far more relevant. You're able to have candidates that will start immediately tomorrow and achieve that all at a cost structure that is dramatically lower than what people would ordinarily find with human processes.
And so when we're talking human processes, you're referring to actually hiring recruiters who sit and, browse through different talent networks, say LinkedIn, and reach out, do initial phone screens and interviews. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, that's part of it, but also even internal human processes, right? Like most founders in building a company and hiring people have to go through a huge volume of manually reviewing resumes and manually conducting interviews. And certain elements of that are awesome and need to be maintained, such as the human connection of making sure that you really want to work with someone. But the unfortunate consequence is that lots of people that are an extremely good fit for a given role might not be considered. And there's not the right sort of wide net that's cast on evaluating candidates, which becomes possible when you're able to lower the cost of assessing each new candidate to the cost of software.
Yeah. So I completely see it from the perspective of if you're doing this at a human level, the net definitely is smaller for what you can manage. But what about in terms of, other pre-existing talent marketplaces with pre-vetted professionals? I'm thinking like TopTal, Turing, both, at least I've seen to be pretty popular for contract software engineers, at least. How do you guys stand out from, say, some of those players?
Yeah, so I'll start with TopTal and then we can get into Turing. TopTal started really as an arbitrage on Eastern European developers, where they would hire people there, they would manually interview them, manually match people with jobs. And it was a much better experience than Upwork, which they were competing against at the time because they could assure a certain level of quality. The flip side of that quality is that they would charge an insane fee structure, oftentimes averaging 40% and not having the same wide net that you can get with automated processes. And so our thought process was, what if you can take this, high service quality of TopTal and finding really high caliber candidates, but instead of having huge margins and huge fees because all of those processes are manual, doing that with software, assessing not just like thousands of people, but hundreds of thousands of people, finding better candidates at a lower cost structure, and delivering them to candidates much faster. So that's the comparison to TopTal and automating those processes. Turing started with the premise of doing a lot of automation in the late 2010s. But the challenge at the time was that LLMs were not capable enough to achieve what they wanted to, or models in general. And it wasn't until, ChatGPT and GPT-4 and all of those models being possible to fine tune that it actually became possible to assess talent at the cost of software. And so Turing built up their entire business as a manual business that was manually doing all of these processes with a lot of AI product marketing and really, really doesn't have complete automation. So multiple executives that have left Turing are now advising us, are excited about the approach of completely automating these processes and really building the best models to predict human ability is the most impactful thing on just ensuring that clients are having good experiences.
Yeah. And so I guess touching on the why now a bit, would you point that to technology, which is sort of the advancements in AI recently allow you to do some of these operations a lot more efficiently and cost effectively?
Hugely. Yeah. I mean, language models are getting extremely intelligent, especially when fine-tuned on the right data sets. And that was just previously impossible. Like the idea of an agent conducting an interview of a human 2 years ago was completely implausible, right? And now agents are able to not only conduct human level interviews, but conduct interviews that are way better. It's as if a human had prepared for 24 hours before their interview, right? Reviewing all of their GitHub repositories, thinking about all of the details of projects that they have on their resume and asking this in-depth, thoughtful interview about someone's background, giving each person the chance to be considered. And that was, wasn't even close to possible before we had super powerful foundations.
Yeah. It sounds like you've sort of offloaded a lot of the vetting process from humans to technology, specifically AI. We have a pretty technical audience. I think it'd be really fun to dive into some of that. On the side of the candidate, they're often, as you mentioned, talking or always talking to the AI interviewer when they first sign up. There's also a resume analyzer tool I believe you guys use, plus a system that you mentioned earlier that can even predict candidate performance. I'd love to just start diving into all of that. What is the technology behind that? How did you start building this? How do you even tackle this problem of teaching AI how to vet a candidate?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's a really challenging problem because humans struggle with it significantly, right? So when you're creating evaluations for model performance, the baseline in question that you're trying to optimize for is very challenging. I would say like the first thing that's really interesting about the product is the AI interviewer, where being able to, scalably do this volume of traffic requires a lot of pre-processing to, achieve the results that we want to, as well as agentic behavior during the interview to be thoughtful about what the next questions are going to be. And then the other thing that's really fascinating are all of the models around predicting which candidates will do well when we're surfacing candidates. The rough framework that we use for this is that there's two dimensions to how good a fit a candidate is for a role. There's the relevancy of that individual, and then there's the excellence of the individual, how competent they are. But these dimensions are like deeply intertwined. And so we do a lot of work with not only leveraging language models, fine-tuning language models on huge amounts of proprietary data, but also on training like learn to rank models from the ground up and doing all sorts of fine-tuned embeddings to surface the best candidates for customers.
Yeah. In terms of like quantifying or even trying to qualify excellence, how do you sort of put that? I mean, you're mentioning how you're fine-tuning models. What data are you looking at? How are you training these models? Anything that you can speak on there would be great.
Yeah, there's two kinds of evaluations or KPIs that we go on. The first are KPIs around human preference, where we have internal members of the team that will create evaluations for like which candidates we think are best for roles, for what reasons. And then we'll map to allowing models to predict that in the same way that humans can, considering, all sorts, leveraging language models and various other models to predict based on all of the attributes of an individual, ranging from features of their GitHub contributions to their facial expression during an interview, who is likely passionate and likely perform well in that given role. The other kind of like evaluation KPI that we go on, and the more important one in particular as we scale, is around customer satisfaction, where we collect the reviews of all of the candidates and the experiences that customers are having on them, and then train models that can predict for a given candidate what is the likely experience that they're going to have. So imagine like a transformer model that could intake all of the performance reviews of candidates for given roles and then can predict what is the most likely next performance review that this candidate is going to have based on all of the data about their background, the role that they're being considered for, and all of the data that we fine-tuned on.
I say, wow. I mean, I think it's really cool. You mentioned you guys are even taking into account facial expression during these AI interviews. I suppose a human does the same thing, right? And so, touching on that a little bit more, since it sounds pretty interesting, is this a matter of sort of collecting all this data, whether it be facial expression plus what they said, and then feeding it to an LLM and letting it reason? Or how are you guys approaching this?
Yeah, so we started out with just textual data, like just the transcript of the interview. And then we expanded to also do visual stuff. And I will say that we're just starting to dip our toes into a lot of the more complicated visual stuff, just because models are only now beginning to have really precise, ability to extract features from these interviews. But I find it to be such like an interesting technical problem because it's something that humans struggle immensely with, and models are actually superhuman at. Like MIT released a paper that they were able to predict the heart rate of an individual in an interview with a reasonably high degree of confidence based on the recording of that interview. And I believe that there's all of these subtle nuances and features of the heart rate of the individual, the facial expressions they have, the tone, all of these, little nuances that actually go a long way in predicting that person's attitude, their passion, their competence, and all of these different characteristics and how they'll perform for a role. And so our focus now is in digging in beyond just what they're saying to all of the other characteristics of that individual and how all of these subtle things that are often overlooked can be priced in reasonably to predict their performance in a given task or job.
And have you seen any promise with that, like being able to take that facial expression or, their voice inflection, whatever it may be, is that actually a pretty reasonable predictor?
So we found that audio is certainly something that's really, really important and has way more signal than people's transcript. However, the visual evaluation is just starting we found some signals in visual evaluation. There's interesting things like the blurriness of someone's camera actually contains some signal.
Wow.
Yeah. And there's like little features like that. We're really just dipping our toes into the facial expression stuff. But I believe that as we get more data about this, that there's going to be a lot of signals that emerge. One thing we talk about a lot internally is that like this fascinating problem of predicting human ability is extremely high dimensional, right? There are so many things that go into what make you good at a given task or job, everything from, all of the different tangentially relevant experiences to your motivation to the manager in that job, whether they're like incentivizing you and you want to do a good job. And because the problem is so high dimensional, similar to predicting the next token in a transformer model, it requires an immense amount of data to actually help you meaningfully extract the right features. And so one of the reasons that we're so excited about the business and all of the progress that we're making is that it allows us to operate at a much larger scale with a lot more data, where we're actually able to make sense of these, small features that we previously weren't able to. And so as the performance data expands, it makes all of that possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to probe a bit more here, just because I find this technology to be so exciting, when you're collecting this information, now are you taking into account more, say, multimodal models, vision language models? Is this where you guys are headed now if you're expanding beyond just the textual space?
Completely, yeah. So that's why the frontier models that can do good multimodal evaluation are extremely compelling to us. And we've been using vision models for a while and are starting to, explore a lot of what's possible with audio models as well as more sophisticated features with vision models. There also are other kinds of custom models we run experiments with, like the facial expression stuff that we were previously discussing is an example of that, and beyond just language models. But there's all sorts of models that go into extracting good features. And then it's about, mapping those features to the right performance metrics that we want to optimize for.
Yeah. And I'm curious, in the early days, I mean, it makes complete sense that once you get a bit more data on one of the candidates, say they've done a couple jobs through the platform, the reviews are pretty valuable. But when it comes to that first almost, zero shot, one shot approach of sort of classifying this candidate, how did you guys sort of test this? Was it just like pray that this works and hopefully the companies like it, or how did you go about that?
It started with a lot of doing things that don't scale and was iterative, of doing human processes and think how we can replace them, where, my co-founders and I have done thousands, not exaggerating ourselves. And we obviously would be able to reach the scale that the models are at now for us at doing hundreds of thousands of interviews. But you gain an immense amount of appreciation for like all the different ways to optimize an interview experience and the importance of automating all of those processes. And so it started with, manually reviewing resumes and then figuring out how we can automate at least the shortlisting, even if not the final review. And then I remember for a time, we automated conducting the interview, but not yet evaluating the interview because it would actually be way faster. We could just like watch interviews on 2x speed and then, and stop an interview if someone wasn't good. And then pushing towards complete automation, which is where we're at today.
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors. Even if you think it's a bit overhyped, AI is suddenly everywhere, from self-driving cars to molecular medicine to business efficiency. If it's not in your industry yet, it's coming fast. But AI needs a lot of speed and computing power. So how do you compete without costs spiraling out of control? Time to upgrade to the next generation of the cloud. Oracle Cloud Infrastructure, or OCI. OCI is a blazing fast and secure platform for your infrastructure, database, application development, plus all your AI and machine learning workloads. OCI costs 50% less for compute and 80% less for networking. So you're saving a pile of money. thousands of businesses have already upgraded to OCI, including Vodafone, Thomson Reuters, and Suno AI. Right now, Oracle is offering to cut your current cloud bill in half if you move to OCI for new U.S. customers with minimum financial commitment. Offer ends March 31st. See if your company qualifies for this special offer at oracle.com/turpentine. That's oracle.com/turpentine. Hey everyone, Eric here. In this environment, founders need to become profitable faster and do more with smaller teams, especially when it comes to engineering. That's why Sean Lanahan started Squad, a specialized global talent firm for top engineers that will seamlessly integrate with your org. Squad offers rigorously vetted top 1% talent that will actually work hard for you every day. Their engineers work in your time zone, follow your processes, and use your tools. Squad has front-end engineers excelling in TypeScript, React, and Next.js ready to onboard to your team today. For backend, Squad engineers are experts at Node.js, Python, Java, and a range of other languages and frameworks. While it may cost more than the freelancer on Upwork billing you for 40 hours, but working only 2, Squad offers premium quality at a fraction of the typical cost, without the headache of assessing for skills and culture fit. Squad takes care of sourcing, legal compliance, and local HR for global talent. Increase your velocity without amping up burn. Visit choosesquad.com and mention Turpentine to skip the waitlist.
I see. What would you say was the most challenging part when it came to building this technology? I mean, it could either be one of these specific features, whether it be the AI interviewer or the resume analyzer, or maybe it was just at a broader level, maybe data collection. Like, what was really hard to get right for this to work?
Yeah, I think the largest challenge, which will continue to be the largest challenge for probably a long, long time in the business, is in predicting who's going to perform well for what reasons. It's just like such a challenging problem because humans aren't very good at it. And there's so many problems within that of collecting the right data. Data is like super subjective and you want to be very thoughtful about, minimizing bias and having peer review on all of that data and having experts that have deep expertise in the domains that the person is discussing, all the way to model architectures, to, different approaches and training them and just optimizing that model to be as predictive as possible is, I think, the most interesting as well as the most challenging problem in the business.
And what would you even start to lay out as potentially a moat? I assume that maybe some of these other players that we previously mentioned might be thinking of, hey, we should maybe use some AI here as well. I believe I've heard maybe a couple other startups have at least looked at the space, maybe none with as much traction as you guys. But how do you think about that, like defensibility?
Yeah. So there's 2 moats that come with a business. And then I'll give a spiel about like my broader take on why labor aggregation is such a large opportunity. The first one is the marketplace, which is that when you're facilitating transactions and you build up a large amount of supply side and a large amount of demand side, there's network effects in, strengthening each other. And so as we get larger and larger, that makes facilitating transactions even easier, and it makes it even more challenging for our competitors. The second moat is around a usage data flywheel, where we're able to learn from not all, but most of our customer interactions to predict based on, the previous 1,000 roles that we placed, who is likely to perform well at the next role. And that can be really, really powerful, especially as we start reaching for placing millions of candidates. Because if others don't have that performance data that's structured in the right way to train an LLM, then they're not going to be even close to competing on the same dimension. I think like at a high level, the reason that I'm so interested in the labor market is that it's the largest market in the world and also the most inefficient. And I really strongly believe that building the infrastructure to collect proprietary data on everyone on earth and why they're a good fit for any role and matching people with those opportunities is not only the largest opportunity in the economy, but also the most defensible one, because it's predicated around really strong network effects and proprietary data to support them. And so I think the defensibility of the business is actually one of the things that made me so excited about Mercor.
And from the perspective of the employers who are using you guys, beyond just doing the vetting for them, which therein allows them to just, in theory, see a lot more candidates, is there other things you offer on the platform that's attractive and makes them use you guys rather than other talent marketplaces?
Yeah. So we also facilitate all of the payments and international compliance associated with these transactions. The reason that we do that is twofold. The first is that this is the solution customers want. They don't want to have to deal with all of the overhead of using different tools, onboarding people, having their own documents. They just want to press a button and have that person ready to go on their team, which is the experience that we deliver for them. And the second thing is that through seeing the entire life of the transaction of how long a customer is working with a candidate, how that experience is going, it allows us to collect really valuable data. And that speaks to the performance data flywheel that we were talking about earlier. If we were to say just be like LinkedIn and, have a candidate that a recruiter can search for and not get any data beyond that, we wouldn't get the most important part of that transaction, which is the ability to predict how well a candidate is going to do. And so really being with a customer through the complete life cycle of seeing their problem in the initial steps and how the solution ends up playing out, obviously in this case, talent, it is immensely important for the data that informs all elements of it.
And for these companies, where does a lot of the cost effectiveness for them come from?
Yeah. So reducing the reliance on recruiters is huge. Another big thing is allowing them to unlock a lot of undiscovered talent internationally. One thing we've found is that many people like the idea of hiring someone in India or South America or Europe or wherever because of better price performance in terms of hiring a better engineer or, technical project manager that can do a good job, will work super hard and not cost as much money. But then they'll have experiences that are more mixed than people they might find in Silicon Valley. And our core belief is that there is incredible talent internationally, but it's not as dense as the talent you find in Silicon Valley. And when you're able to automate the process of assessing that talent, solving this talent density problem, then you're able to find the diamonds in the rough. You're able to find the people no one else is considering and just create incredible experiences for both sides. Like I can't tell you how many stories we've had of people we've hired from, parts of India in particular that are phenomenal engineers. Honestly, like much better than many engineers we work with in Silicon Valley, aren't given opportunities, even remotely in the same ballpark. And through allowing them to discover these opportunities, it changes their lives. And the idea of doing that for like a given individual is really fulfilling. But the idea of scaling that for thousands or millions of people is even more meaningful.
How do you kind of show to these companies that the technology that you have built for vetting is, up to par, it's up to standard? I'm curious what that sales cycle almost looks like.
It's funny because there's so many companies out there now, especially that say that they're AI companies, right? And how they're using AI to help solve a customer problem. And we took this really unique approach, which is instead of just saying we're an AI company and then sending them a resume, we showed them what we were doing. We showed them like why we're selecting candidates. We showed recording of the AI interview that's being conducted of the candidate. So clients can watch that interview, see that it's a thorough interview and decide, whether or not like our vetting was thorough enough based on that. We show them the, analysis of the work experience of that individual that has the GitHub contributions that we're assessing, as well as a summary of why we selected that individual for their query. And so I think that in demonstrating technology rather than just talking about it, it becomes much more powerful in customers believing that you're leveraging things at the cutting edge to create good experiences.
So if you're offering AI, you're also citing your sources to almost ensure that the AI is working.
Exactly. It's really, really important, right? Like I think customers over time can build a lot of trust in us, but it makes sense that they would want to double check, especially as they're getting started. And so we really facilitate that versus other players in the space, which we talked about earlier, have so much branding as AI companies. And we've talked to, executives at all of these companies that corroborate that they're not AI companies. They just talk about it, and they're not actually automating these manual processes because they've built their entire businesses around services, not around product. And so I think keeping this like maniacal focus on complete automation and showing to customers the automation that we're doing is really important.
Yeah. And you mentioned sort of the international talent space almost being a niche for you guys. Would you say that is sort of the wedge right now? What are most people using you guys for? Is it to hire folks internationally? And then if so, what type of roles are they hiring?
Yeah. So we initially hired a lot of people, particularly in India, software engineers in India. Then we expanded to all countries, and now we're expanding to all domains. So while majority of our business is still software engineers, and we've hired well over 1,000 software engineers, it's now expanding into many, many other domains, all sorts of business roles, into medical, legal roles, et cetera. And the reason is that the technology is really broadly applicable. When you are able to conduct a really good interview of a candidate and you're able to evaluate the resume really well, it's applicable to a lot more than just software engineering. And actually, the other thing I'll mention on this, which is like a really interesting technical point, is that there's a lot of transfer learning associated with making predictions across different kinds of models. And that if we make a model really good at predicting performance reviews for software engineers, it's actually much easier for it to learn how to predict who's going to be a good lawyer or a good doctor with far less data. And so this really goes to show how interesting the usage data network effect is as we expand to all of these new roles, all of these new disciplines within the economy.
Yeah, that was actually going to be my next question about sort of how easy it is to move across domains, right? If you're fine tuning these models, do you have to keep it specific to, say, software engineers? And I'd also be curious for you to touch upon that a little bit. I mean, it sounds like if you're taking into account data points like how nice, like how well their camera's working, it maybe speaks to intangibles more than even something specific. How do you see that sort of playing out for all industries? Like, how do you expand to hiring lawyers on top of software engineers?
Yeah, so we have to create labels and new domains such that we're like well positioned for them. And it's difficult to like say we wanted to add a new entirely unique domain without any labels, the models would probably struggle a little bit. However, if there's some overlap in domains or we add a small amount of like fine tuning data to the models at different parts in the stack, it's able to unlock a lot of new abilities. And so that can be really, really exciting. And yeah, it's super contextual to the role, and models are often unpredictable. So there's like scaling laws around all of this kind of stuff. And the more data that we get on software engineers, the better the model gets at evaluating all other roles.
So serving a new role would sort of require collecting a bit more data on that and perhaps fine tuning again.
But oftentimes not as much as people would think. It's hard for me to give a really precise answer because it's so dependent on the role, right? Like as an example, say you have a lot of data on what makes a good full stack engineer, and now you want to predict what makes a good backend engineer. There's, not too much nuance that it's like pretty easy for the transfer learning to apply to such a similar role versus if you want to predict what makes a good designer, it's going to really struggle. And so it's very dependent on like how related the attributes that you'd look for are in a given role to the attributes that you would look for in that new role, with some roles being quite challenging and others being much easier.
We touched upon this a bit when I asked how are companies sort of vetting your vetting, like making sure that you're doing it right. But you mentioned like you need data on what makes a good designer, right? Say you've trained the model, you get an output. How do you just internally validate like, hey, this model is doing well or not doing well? This is actually a good designer. This is actually not a good designer. Is it pretty manual? Like, do you yourself just need to kind of do it by inspection, or how do you do this systematically?
Yeah, so we do occasionally have, human teams that'll use the product and find like if there is a result that shouldn't be there, why it's getting surfaced, how can we fix that? And then I think the most important one is really the customer data of customers, telling us, giving us preference data of who they want to hire for which reasons, of whether that person is performing well. And as the customer data begins to scale, we're leaning less and less on our own human teams that can help create data.
Yeah. We've talked a whole lot about how, at least from the side of the employers, this is amazing. Let's see a lot more candidates, sort of offloads the vetting process. You also briefly touched on from the side of the candidates. Could you speak a bit more about how this sort of helps them? I'm sure a lot of folks, especially overseas, are actually really loving something like this that's legitimate, systematic, and works.
Absolutely. I mean, there are so many people in the US, let alone abroad, that have applied to dozens, if not hundreds of jobs and just not heard back from the vast majority of them because of extremely irrational resume screens. They don't get feedback on why they're not getting considered for opportunities, and the process is wildly unfair. But when you're able to lower the cost of assessing talent to zero and do so in a centralized fashion where they apply to one platform that can facilitate transactions with hundreds of companies, it just makes it a way better experience. So I think the three things that candidates love about our platform are, first of all, that we consider everyone in a fair way, not just based on the credentials on their interviews or on their resumes. The second thing is that candidates are able to get feedback on their resumes, on their interviews, why they're performing well and selected for a role. And then the third thing is that they apply to one place that considers their applications for hundreds of companies that are hiring for thousands of roles. And so it's just a far, far more efficient structure than this very disaggregated labor market that we see today.
Yeah, that's really powerful. Stepping away a bit from the technology and maybe heading towards the world of, distributing this out to people. Obviously, you're creating a marketplace, comes with a bit of a chicken and an egg problem. You need employers to use you to sort of attract candidates. At the same time, you need those candidates to have the employers consider you. How do you guys go about doing this? Early days, how are you getting candidates and how are you getting employers?
Yeah, it's hard to start a marketplace early on. And this is where a lot of the network effects come from. And so it was a lot of hustling, starting with customer needs and finding candidates that are a good fit to fill those roles and brute forcing it in a lot of ways early on. Now we've had this really interesting insight, which is that one of the inherent challenges of marketplaces is the chicken and egg problem that you're describing. But if you're able to create intrinsic value on one side of the marketplace that can unlock growth there, then you can facilitate far more transactions, get people in new networks where you don't yet have demand, and create a lot more opportunities. So that's why we've been investing in building out these resume feedback and interview feedback tools, giving them away for free to candidates so that they can come to our platform, they can see feedback on their resumes, practice their interviews, gain a lot of intrinsic value. And then while they're at it, get matched with all of the opportunities that we have from employers. And so the focus is on being the one spot that solves all of the problems for a customer or for an applicant, where they come, they can improve their application and then also get matched with opportunities.
I see. So solving that problem was a little bit more on the candidate side, sort of giving them these tools like resume feedback. And these tools are, I'm assuming you're using the same AI here, right? You're doing this automatically. And what are you sort of giving back to them in this feedback? Is it telling them like a score you're creating on them, or is it actual written feedback about how they're interviewing?
Yeah, it's both. So we give them scores and then we also give them written feedback. The interview feedback is still in beta, so it's not available to everyone. The resume feedback is available to everyone. The interview feedback soon will be available to everyone. And it leans on a lot of our existing knowledge, though, and data in terms of what is effective. Though it's a little bit of a different problem in that there are certain things that people can and can't control about their application. So it's important to be thoughtful about, telling them to improve in the ways that they can control and less so in the things that they.
Yeah. I guess I'm curious about that. When it comes to resume feedback, is it most like stylistic? Like, keep it on a page, don't make it too, or how is that?
Yeah, there's a lot of stylistic feedback. Also, reformatting resumes for people can be super helpful. And there's a lot of challenges that people, particularly internationally, have with formatting resumes in ways that are picked up effectively by parsers and surfacing all of that data effectively. A lot of stylistic things. We're also interested in exploring giving people career suggestions where we can help be their coach and partner throughout their process of career development and what opportunities are the best fit for them, what things they should do to help be more desirable to employers, like, doing projects to play around with LLMs and all sorts of stuff like that.
Wow, that's really exciting. And could you maybe speak to some of the work being there? I know even at large companies, there often be sort of internal tools when it comes to career planning and, how to progress at the company. What are you guys looking at to do here?
Yeah. So I think it's a very general thing in that we want something that's broadly applicable to all candidates, but it's in predicting based on all of their past experiences, what is the ideal next experience for them or all based on all their preferences and interests. And then what things do they need to accomplish to get there? So it might be that they want to be an MLE at a hypergrowth startup, and we can talk about all of the different attributes of their applications that a hypergrowth startup would be looking for, the things that they should talk about in an interview, where to really spend their time in having this general overarching solution.
Yeah. And in terms of, on the candidate side, you mentioned early on it was working with a lot of folks out in India. How did you get embedded into that space? I take it you were living here and are still quite, young, which is very impressive for all that you guys have already achieved. So don't mean that as a negative point, but how did you go about even embedding into that space? I assume that's a bit difficult.
Yeah, I know. I told one of our clients the other day about how I was celebrating my 21st birthday party, and they didn't they didn't mind. The start was working with code clubs at IIT. We started with the code club at IIT Kharagpur, where they were referring us candidates, and we were hiring them just to build projects out ourselves. And it was ridiculous because there were these incredible engineers that, we were like college kids at the time, didn't have much money. They were getting offers from like big tech jobs in India for like $5 an hour. And so it's not difficult to be competitive from a salary standpoint. And so, creating more opportunities for people that are particularly young internationally and was a big trend early on.
Yeah, that's really powerful. And touch on that a little bit more. What were these projects that you had them doing?
I mean, that's really what Mercor grew out of, is that we were hiring people to build products ourselves. Like I launched this other company, Saros, which was a browser-based virtual machine and had been working on various cloud GUIs because I launched a business that I scaled in high school. And with hiring development talent, it was a pain. It was wildly inefficient. And so we built the product for ourselves, trying to make that process more efficient. And that went pretty far.
Oh, wow. So Mercor came out of a problem that you were personally facing.
Yeah, exactly. And another interesting thing is we've used the product to hire over 20 people to our internal team. So we're actively hire tons of people using the product. And so we're huge believers in this just being an efficient way to build out a company. And while I still think it's good for Silicon Valley startups to have an in-person product team in particular, where leadership is having those, late night conversations and bouncing ideas off of each other with super low latency, I think supplementing each person in the US with one or two contractors internationally is extremely high leverage from a price, a performance perspective, as well as culture. And just like people we've found internationally care so much and want to work so hard that it's really unbelievable how inefficient the market is around not giving them opportunities.
Yeah. And so a lot of the folks who you guys have on as full-time or part-time, I'm assuming are overseas. What have been sort of the learnings and sort of getting that to work? I mean, for starters, the most obvious, like time difference, right? How do you sort of balance stuff like that?
Yeah. So it's predominantly in India where there is, the 12.5 hour gap. The thing I found fascinating about the time difference point is for sales kind of roles, this could be a problem, but we're mainly hiring engineers in India. And for engineers, it's actually a feature, not a bug, to have all of this independent contributor time. So we have overlap in the mornings until about noon. And then for the rest of the day, people are able to just focus, code, work on the tasks and projects that are assigned. And so it allows them to actually be a lot more productive in many ways. And we've had cases, where we fly engineers back and forth. And I think it's a fun experience to get to know everyone, but it's funny. It's oftentimes less productive than people being at home, able to really focus on the work that's happening.
We've skipped over this so far, but I want to absolutely touch upon it. You guys have quite the founding team, the three of you, yourself, Adarsh, Hermad. You guys went to high school together, if I'm remembering correctly, are policy debate champions. Touch on that background a little bit. Plus, you guys are so young. I mean, it's honestly amazing. I'd love to kind of hear about the background. How'd you guys decide to work together? I know you mentioned you were working on something. Were you working on that with them?
Yeah. Well, so I wasn't a policy debate champion, but I grew up in the Bay Area, met them at Bellarmine, San Jose for high school. Adarsh and Surya were the winningest debate team of all time.
Wow. As someone who did debate, I mean, that's crazy. These guys were killing me.
Yeah. Well, and I'm defining that by they did policy debate, the most competitive event, and were the first team ever to win all three of the largest national tournaments, which is challenging because they're all very different styles of debate. And so they were incredible at debate. I'm dyslexic though, so I'm not very good at debate. I wasn't nearly as good as them, but I was always building startups in one form or another. So I bootstrapped a company doing cloud consulting. In high school, I found that with this AWS Activate program to get cloud credits, there were a lot of startups that were eligible for the program, but were not applying and getting their cloud credits. So I would charge startups $995 to, be a consultant for them, get them the cloud credits, get them like 5 to 25K in cloud credits. And I did this a bunch. So I made a lot of money in high school and I wanted to build software. So I put some of the cash into working with Adarsh at the time to build better user interfaces for AWS, just like GUIs. They didn't work very well. So that didn't go very far. But I was super interested in like cloud interfaces being super inefficient. And so I started this company, Ceros, that they were helping out a little bit with, which was like a browser-based virtual machine. We were hiring people at the IITs in India to help do this. And so that was cool and it won some awards, but I think we were much more excited about Mercor, and that was really where our hearts lied. So decided to go full-time on the business over the summer in 2023. I remember Adarsh was stressed about whether he should turn down his offer from Bridgewater and all that kind of stuff. And so I think he's glad he did it at this point. And we bootstrapped the business to a 7-figure run rate. And it's funny, like even after doing that, my parents were like, "Oh, you should still go back to school." And I was like, "No way." And then we raised a little bit of money from General Catalyst. And all of a sudden they're like, "Oh, well, good that you dropped out." Right. So yeah, we drop out all at 20 years old. And then it's been all up from there. We all got the Teal Fellowship after dropping out. And so we were us and Edge were some of the first teams in history where all three co-founders have received the Teal Fellowship. So working with that team has been incredible. And it's been a fun ride since.
So in high school, you're working with cloud interfaces, as every average high schooler does, right? And then you went to college, you guys went to college together and then dropped out, and sort of what is your kind of background? Is it more of a technical one, or are all three of you sort of technical, or what is it?
Yeah, I would say all three of us are technical to varying degrees. I was at Georgetown with Surya. I was studying finance and econ. Surya was studying international econ, but like I started coding when I was in 3rd grade. So very young. And then Adarsh was at Harvard studying CS. And I mainly was doing like front end development for the life cycle or for the early stages of the business. And I don't do much coding now, but Adarsh and Surya do in a significant way. And so, yeah, I actually never originally wanted to go to college. I refused to apply to schools and my parents were not excited about that. And so I appeased them and applied at the last minute. And I told them I would drop out the entire time. They didn't believe me until I actually did it. But I think now they've finally come around on the decision.
Yeah. Well, man, coding at 3, mid 7-figure business at 20. I hope my parents never sort of hear about you in the news because it'll be rough for me, but that's honestly very impressive. And congratulations on Teal Fellowship. Saw that alongside the Esh team. That's amazing. And I guess, sort of the final questions here in terms of the building the team, how many people are you at right now? Are you guys hiring? And if so, who are the types of people you're looking for? What's sort of the culture that people can expect and what can they be working on when they join?
Absolutely. So we're at 11 full-time employees in the US, as well as about 20 contractors internationally in India. And we're hiring hugely. We have, big things to announce soon, not yet on the fundraising front, and are really stepping on the gas with full stack engineer hires, machine learning engineer hires, as well as operations people to help out with managing engagements with clients, particularly large foundation model customers. So there's a lot of interesting aspects on that. And I think anyone who's looking for a really intense environment of working super hard that has an exceptional background, not per se on the resume, but just having worked on very cool things, it is certainly someone we'd love to talk to. So feel free to just shoot me an email at brendan@mercor.com, and I would love to chat and hopefully explore adding you to the team.
And they can also just join Mercor and perhaps get recruited from there.
That's true. That's another way that we hire. Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess sort of, some of the final things here, looking into the future, what's sort of next for you guys? What is the big problem you're trying to solve right now? What can folks expect as updates on the product in the coming year or two?
Yeah, there's this recurring effort to improve the models of the product. And so that's very significant and ongoing. Then the other one is just a whole new suite of feedback tools, ability to share profiles on the applicant experience. I think changing the applicant experience from a application process to a platform that people can interact with, that they can visit on a regular basis is one of the largest changes that the large volumes of users are going to be seeing soon.
That's awesome. Well, Brendan, thank you so much for taking the time. As mentioned, anyone interested, please check out Mercor. If you're looking for a job, definitely use them. And if you're interested in Mercor, feel free to reach out to Brendan directly. It was so great having you here and best of luck in the future.
Absolutely. It was a wonderful conversation and I appreciate you having me.
Awesome.
Turpentine VC is a podcast from Turpentine, the network behind Moment of Zen and Econ 102. If you liked the episode, please leave a review in the Apple Store or rate us on Spotify. Hey everyone, Eric here. At Turpentine, we're building the first media outlet for tech people by tech people. We're the network behind the show you're listening to right now. We have a slate of hit shows across a range of topics and industries, from our AI and investing cluster of podcasts to shows that drive the conversation in tech with the most interesting thinkers, founders, investors, and influencers, like Econ 102 with Noah Smith. We're launching new shows every week, and we're looking for industry-leading sponsors. If you think that might be you and your company, email me at ericaturpentine.co. That's ERIK at turpentine.co, and let's partner together.